candles at the Ashford Winter Ball had been burning for 3 hours when Viola Ashcroft set her papers on the table and began to speak, and the cold that had followed her in from the December street still clung to the hem of her gown. She had walked the last quarter-mile because the hired cab had thrown a wheel, and she had arrived with rain-damp gloves and a ledger pressed against her side, like something she intended to protect with her body if she had to. The men around the table were not listening, not truly, and she had known they would not be before she arrived, because they never did, not the first time, and sometimes not the second. But she had numbers, she had names, she had 14 girls who could read, who could cipher, who could write a letter of reference in their own hand, and she had learned long ago that facts, arranged carefully enough, had a way of entering rooms that women were not supposed to enter. She spread her papers across the white cloth and did not apologize for taking the space. And then, from the far end of the table, a man she did not recognize leaned toward his companion and said, quite clearly, quite cheerfully, as though the words were meant only for one person and had simply escaped. She was the cheapest, you know, of all the causes presented this quarter. Cheapest by a considerable margin. Laughter moved around the table like a wave. Viola Ashcroft stopped speaking. She turned. She found the man's eyes, pale, amused, belonging to a face that was accustomed to being found charming. And she held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she executed a curtsy so precise, so perfectly measured, that it silenced the room by its very completeness. And she said, in a voice that carried without effort, "And I am worth more than you will ever be able to afford, my lord." She straightened. She found her place in her notes, and she continued her presentation without pause, without tremor, without a single glance back at the man who had gone quite still at the far end of the table. His name, she learned afterward from the host's wife, was Lord Peregrine Carfax, Viscount Dunmore. He was 41 years old, an unexpected heir, and apparently famous for saying uncomfortable things in pleasant voices. The host's wife said this with a kind of fond exasperation that suggested she had forgiven him for it more than once. Viola thanked her for the information and did not say what she thought of it. The room dispersed in stages, the way rooms at winter balls always did, men drifting toward the fire, women toward each other, the host toward anyone with an untouched glass. Viola gathered her papers with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and expected to do it many more. She was reaching for the ledger when she noticed the card. It had been placed on the tablecloth beside her hand, face down, slid with some deliberateness to a position she could not overlook. She did not need to turn it over to know whose it was. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her ledger, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of the Ashford ballroom, leaving the card precisely where it had been placed, face down on the white cloth in the light of the guttering candles. She did not look back. The school occupied the ground floor and first floor of a converted townhouse on a Mayfair side street that the fashionable world had not quite reached and the commercial world had not quite claimed, which meant the rent had been manageable, just barely, for 3 years running. Viola arrived the following morning before the girls, she always did, and found her assistant, Mrs. Partridge, already at the small desk in the anteroom with the morning correspondence sorted into 2 piles. The pile that required immediate attention and the pile that required courage. The larger pile is the courage one, Mrs. Partridge said, which was not a joke. The rain had followed Viola from the previous evening and was now pressing itself against the schoolhouse windows with a kind of determined persistence. The girls arrived in 1s and 2s, damp-coated ranging from 8 to 14, and the sound of them settling into their lesson, the scrape of chairs, the opening of copybooks, the low voice of the reading teacher beginning her first sentence, was the sound Viola had built her adult life around. She stood in the doorway of the anteroom and listened to it for a moment before she sat down with the ledger. The anonymous quarterly donation had not arrived. She found this in the records after 20 minutes of careful review, the absence of it as conspicuous as a missing tooth. The donation had come without fail for 6 months. Always the same amount, always through the same channel, always arriving in the first week of the quarter with a transfer receipt that bore a solicitor's mark she did not recognize, but had stopped questioning because the money was real and the school needed it. This quarter, nothing. It may simply be delayed, Mrs. Partridge offered, reading Viola's expression with the accuracy of someone who had worked beside her for 2 years. It may be, Viola said, and turned to the second pile. The letter from the solicitor's office was 3 paragraphs long and written in the particular language of legal correspondence that has been designed to sound neutral while delivering information that is not. The building's lease, it informed her, was under review by the property's new controlling interest. Lady Cressida Dunham had acquired the adjacent properties on the street and was petitioning the borough to reclassify the current building's designated use from educational to commercial. The review process, the letter noted, was already underway. Viola read it twice. She set it on the desk. She looked at the window, where the rain was still making its argument against the glass. Then she stood, opened the anteroom door, and said to Mrs. Partridge, "Carry on with the morning lesson. I will review the rest of the correspondence this afternoon." She said it in a voice that gave nothing away, which was the voice she had been practicing for 11 years. 3 days later, the formal eviction notice arrived by messenger at 7 in the morning, and it gave the school 30 days to vacate the premises. 30 days. The words had the blunt finality of a door closing, and Viola read them standing in the anteroom in her coat, still holding the messenger's receipt, before she had removed her gloves. She did not tell Mrs. Partridge immediately. She folded the notice, put it in her coat pocket, and walked the 3/4 of a mile to Dunmore House in the rain without a cab and without an umbrella, which was not a decision so much as an oversight she refused to correct once she had made it. The butler at Dunmore House was a large, composed man who had clearly been trained to manage difficult arrivals, and he managed her with considerable skill for approximately 45 seconds before she informed him, pleasantly, that she had not given her name because her name was not relevant to the matter, and that she would wait in the entrance hall for as long as necessary, and that she was, as he could observe, entirely capable of standing without assistance for extended periods. He left. He returned. He showed her in. Peregrine Carfax was at his desk when she walked into the study without announcement, and he looked up with the expression of a man who has been interrupted before, but rarely by someone who entered without knocking. He was in his shirt sleeves, which she registered and dismissed in the same moment. She crossed the room, took the eviction notice from her coat pocket, and placed it on the desk in front of him. "Lady Cressida Dunham has given my school 30 days to vacate," Viola said. "You have influence with the borough. You have influence with at least 4 of the property owners on that street. A single letter from you, 1 letter, 2 paragraphs, could halt the reclassification petition long enough for a legal challenge to be mounted." She paused. "I am not asking you for that letter. I am giving you the opportunity to write it or to decline so that we both know exactly what kind of man you are." Peregrine looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the eviction notice and read it. He read all of it, which took longer than she expected because most men in her experience read documents of this kind for the general shape of the problem and not the specific detail. He read the specific detail. "How many girls are currently enrolled?" he asked. 14, Viola said, ranging in age from 7 to 15. 3 of them have no family to return to if the school closes. He set the notice down on the desk and was quiet for a moment that she could not quite read. Then he reached forward and rang the bell beside the inkstand. "I need a week," he said. A servant appeared in the doorway. Peregrine asked for tea. Viola had prepared herself for dismissal. She had prepared, if she was honest, for something worse. For the pleasant condescension she had learned to expect from men who found charitable causes charming in the abstract and inconvenient in the particular. She had not prepared for a man who read the entire document, asked about the children by number and age, and then rang for tea as though the problem were something he intended to think about seriously over the next 7 days. She left Dunmore House with nothing settled and the eviction notice still on his desk. And she walked back to the school in the same rain, which had not improved, and found waiting on the front step a large black umbrella that had clearly been sent ahead by someone who had anticipated her route. She stood and looked at it. Then she picked it up and went inside. Peregrine's solicitor contacted her 2 days later with preliminary legal steps already initiated against Lady Cressida Dunham's reclassification petition. The letter was formal, precise, and gave no indication of its author's personal involvement beyond the professional. Viola read it at the school desk and then read it again, looking for the shape of the man behind it. They met formally for the first time at the solicitor's office on a Wednesday morning. A narrow, well-ordered room smelling of beeswax and old paper, with a clerk who wrote very fast and looked at no one. Peregrine arrived exactly on time, which she had not expected. And he had brought the annotations on the lease documents, which she had expected even less. They worked through the papers side by side across the solicitor's table for 90 minutes. And he asked questions that were specific and practical, and suggested he had read everything the solicitor had sent him with the same attention he had given the eviction notice. He did not mention the Ashford ball. Neither did she. The second meeting was less orderly. It took place in a rain-soaked carriage moving between borough offices on a Thursday afternoon. The documents spread across the seat between them, the windows opaque with weather. Viola was explaining the significance of a particular clause in the original lease when the carriage hit a wet cobblestone at speed and lurched violently to the left, and the papers went in 3 directions, and her hand went sideways, and Peregrine caught both, the papers with his left hand and her wrist with his right, in a single reflex that was over before she had fully registered it had begun. He released her wrist immediately, set the papers back on the seat between them, and said, "I apologize for the documents." Not for catching her. For the documents. Viola looked out the opaque window and said nothing, and the carriage continued through the rain. That evening, back at the school after the girls had gone home, she sat alone in the record room with 6 years of financial files spread across the floor around her. She was looking for documentation, anything that could support the legal case for the school's established educational use. Anything that showed continuous operation, community impact, formal enrollment. She found all of it, because she had kept records with the precision of someone who had always known the day might come when she would need to prove the school's existence to someone who did not want to believe in it. And then, in the 3rd year of records, she found something else. The donation receipts. 6 months of them, from the anonymous quarterly donor. She had filed them without examining them closely because the money had arrived, and the school had needed it, and she had been too busy to ask questions she could not answer. But now, cross-referencing against the older files for the legal case, she found it. A solicitor's mark, a specific, small, distinctive mark in the corner of each receipt. She had seen that mark before. She turned back through the files, further back, and found it again. In documents from 2 years ago, from 3 years ago, from 4. Not 6 months. 4 years of donations at minimum, possibly more, all bearing the same mark, all in the same hand on the transfer receipts, all arriving at the same quarterly interval with a reliability of something that had been arranged deliberately and maintained consistently by someone who had not wanted to be asked about it. Viola sat on the floor of the record room with the files around her and looked at the mark for a long time. She did not yet know the name behind it, but she understood, for the first time, that someone had been watching over this school from a distance for years. Not out of casual generosity, not out of social obligation, but with the sustained, deliberate attention of someone who had made a decision and kept it quietly, in the dark, without recognition, without return. She stayed with that understanding until the candle burned low. Then she put the files away and went to bed. Lady Cressida Dunham moved with the efficiency of someone who had been planning this longer than Viola had known she existed. Within 48 hours of the legal challenge being filed, 2 board members who had previously offered letters of support withdrew them, separately on consecutive days, with letters of apology that were nearly identical in phrasing, which told Viola everything she needed to know about where the letters had originated. The rumor reached her at a Tuesday afternoon tea hosted by a woman who collected charitable causes the way other women collected porcelain, with enthusiasm and no particular expertise. Viola was at the far end of the room when she heard it. That the enrollment figures presented at the Ashford Ball had been embellished, that the examination results were not independently verified, that the school's accounts did not bear close inspection. The woman saying it was not addressing Viola directly. She was addressing the woman beside her, in the particular caring voice of someone who intends to be overheard. Viola set down her teacup. She did not respond. She spoke to the hostess about an unrelated matter for another 10 minutes, accepted a biscuit she did not eat, and left with the same composure she had brought in. She had learned, through long practice, that responding to a rumor in the room where it was circulating gave it exactly the oxygen it needed. That evening, she was in the school's small music room, which contained a piano of uncertain age and considerable character, and she was playing Bach, the Prelude in C, which she had been playing since she was 11 years old, and which she returned to now the way other women returned to prayer, because it required complete attention and left no space in the mind for anything else. The candle on the piano was the only light. The rain was at the window again. She was 3 pages in when she heard the front door, heard Mrs. Partridge's voice, heard a second voice that she recognized, and then heard footsteps in the corridor. Peregrine appeared in the music room doorway, holding a document and looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify. She did not stop playing. He stood in the doorway for the remainder of the piece, 2 minutes, perhaps slightly more. Without speaking, without moving, without doing anything that suggested he found the situation unusual. When she finished and lifted her hands from the keys, the room was very quiet. He came in without asking. He sat down beside her on the piano bench, leaving careful space between them, and placed the document on the piano lid. She looked at it. It required her signature on a declaration of continuous educational use, which was the document they had been waiting for from the solicitor. Neither of them spoke for a moment that had a particular quality to it. Not uncomfortable, not easy, but weighted with something that had been accumulating since the carriage and the wrist and the umbrella that had appeared on the doorstep. Viola placed her right hand over his left, where it rested on the edge of the keyboard, and she pressed one note down. A single clear note that rang in the quiet room and then faded. She lifted her hand. He did not move his. Then he picked up the document, signed it on the piano lid with the pen from his coat pocket, and left it beside the candle. He stood, said good evening, and left the music room. She heard the front door close behind him. She sat at the piano for a long time afterward, her hands in her lap, looking at his signature drying on the page. The solicitor's clerk was a small, careful man named Aldous, who had helped Viola with 2 previous legal matters, and who understood that when she brought him a specific question, she wanted a specific answer and not a discussion of the difficulties involved in obtaining one. She gave him the solicitor's mark from the donation receipts and asked him to trace the name behind it. He said he would need 3 days, She said she would return in 2. The name he gave her was Dunmore. She sat in the clerk's small office with the paper in her hand and read the name twice. Lord Peregrine Carfax, Viscount Dunmore. The same solicitor's mark on every donation receipt, going back not 6 months but 4 years and 7 months. To a quarter that Viola now calculated had fallen approximately 8 weeks after the school's founding notice appeared in the Gazette. She had placed that notice herself, a small advertisement, 2 column inches, describing a new educational institution for working-class girls in Mayfair, founded by the widow of Mr. Edmund Ashcroft on the remains of her dowry. She had paid for the advertisement with money she could not entirely afford, and had told no one she had placed it. She thanked the clerk. She walked home. She sat in her own rooms, not the school, her own rooms, which were 2 streets away and considerably smaller. And she did not contact Peregrine for the rest of that day, or that evening, or that night. She thought about the Ashford ball. She thought about a man who had called her the cheapest cause of the quarter in a room full of people who laughed, and who had, for 4 years before that moment, been quietly ensuring that her school did not close. She thought about the fact that he had not known, until that evening, that the widow behind the Gazette notice was the same woman standing at the patrons' table with a ledger pressed against her side. She thought about what it meant that a man who hid behind charm and wit had been in the dark for years, doing something useful and asking nothing for it. In the morning, she went to Dunmore House. This time the butler showed her in without argument, which meant Peregrine had left instructions, which meant he had been expecting her. He was standing by the window when she came in, not at his desk, and he turned when she entered. She stood in the doorway. "How long?" she asked. He did not pretend not to understand the question. 4 years and 7 months, he said. I read the notice in the Gazette. A widow who had opened a school for working-class girls in Mayfair on what remained of her dowry. He paused. I did not know until the Ashford ball that the widow was you. Why did you never say so? Viola asked. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when he had set down the wit and was speaking without it. Recognition has always felt emptier to me than usefulness, he said. I have attended enough dinners where men are thanked for their generosity to know that the thanks is generally more comfortable for the recipient than the giving was. I preferred the giving. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. And she thought about 3 committees that had laughed her out of the room. She thought about every time she had rebuilt, and every layer of armor she had added afterward, and the particular way she had learned to expect condescension from powerful men because experience had taught her that expecting anything else was a form of carelessness she could not afford. She said, "That is an unusual preference." "I am aware," he said. She left without resolving anything between them. But she did not leave angry, and she knew, walking back through the December street, that the distance she had kept was going to be considerably harder to maintain now that she understood what it was she was keeping herself distant from. Lady Cressida's counter-petition arrived at the borough office on a Friday morning. 11 signatures from property owners on the surrounding streets. The petition formally scheduled for a public hearing 12 days out. 12 days. The 30-day window was still open, but barely, and a hearing loss would effectively end the legal challenge before the property deed question could be resolved. Peregrine told her at the solicitor's office, where they had met to review the counter-petition documents, that the hearing could be won. He said it plainly, without the social lacquer he applied to most statements, which she had come to recognize as a signal that he meant it precisely. But I would need to appear beside you, he said, as a named supporter. On record. Publicly. Viola looked at the document on the table between them. You have maintained your anonymity for 4 years, she said. Yes, he said quietly. Appearing publicly removes that permanently. Also yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I cannot accept. He looked at her without speaking, which was the version of him she found most difficult to manage, because the wit gave her something to push against, and the silence gave her nothing. This school exists, Viola said, to demonstrate that women can build something of value without requiring a man's name on the door to legitimize it. If I save it by putting your name on the door, I have disproved the school's own argument. Every girl who learns to read in that building will learn it in a room that was saved by male patronage, and I will have to explain to them why that was necessary, and I will not have a satisfactory answer. That is a principled position, Peregrine said. It is the correct position. Is it the only reason you are refusing? She did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer, and she knew he recognized it as one. She set the document down and said, without quite looking at him, If I accept, I will not be able to maintain the distance I have kept since I learned what you are. And I have found that distance useful. Useful, he repeated, in a tone that was not quite irony and not quite something else. Necessary, she said, which was more honest. He did not offer her reassurance. He did not tell her the distance was unnecessary, or that she was wrong to want it, or that she could trust him because he had earned it. He said, The decision is entirely yours. I will wait. She looked at him then, directly for a moment that had the same quality as the music room. Waited, precise, not comfortable, but not unwanted. If I agree, she said, the school's records go into evidence, everything. 4 years of donation receipts, all bearing your solicitor's mark. It will be public. I know, he said. You understand what society will make of it. A Viscount anonymously funding a widow's school for 4 years, then appearing publicly to defend it. I have some familiarity with what society makes of things, Peregrine said. And there was something in his voice. Not bitterness, but the particular tone of someone who has spent a long time not caring what society made of things, and has occasionally found that exhausting. I find I mind it considerably less than I expected. Viola was quiet for another moment. Then she said, I will agree. He nodded once, and she could see in the set of his shoulders something that was not quite relief and not quite resolve, but some compound of both. They signed the provisional agreement outside the school the following afternoon, on the front step, in thin winter sunlight that had appeared briefly between 2 banks of cloud. She signed first, then he. He folded the document and handed it to Mrs. Partridge, who had come to the door and then retreated with the tact of someone who could read a situation accurately. And then, in the moment after Mrs. Partridge had gone back inside and the door had not yet closed entirely, Peregrine kissed her. Brief, certain, with the directness of someone who had decided something and was not going to pretend otherwise. Viola took a step back. She looked at him. That was not in the contract, she said. Consider it an additional clause, he said. I can have the solicitor formalize it, if you prefer. She looked at him for one more moment, and something happened to her face that she did not entirely intend. And then she went inside and closed the door, and stood in the anteroom listening to his footsteps descend the front steps, and did not permit herself to examine what she felt about it until much later, when the girls had gone home and the school was quiet. The borough hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in a room that smelled of old wood and recent anxiety, with a hearing officer behind a long table and benches for observers arranged in rows behind the presenting parties. Lady Cressida Dunham sat to one side with her legal representative. A thin, meticulous man, who had clearly been selected for his ability to make commercial interest sound like civic improvement. Viola sat at the table across from him with her files, her enrollment records, her examination results, and 6 years of documented community impact, organized into a presentation she had been refining since 2 o'clock in the morning. Peregrine sat in the gallery, not at the table. He had been clear about this, visible but not leading, present but not speaking, unless called upon. She had not argued with the arrangement, because it was the right one. She presented for 40 minutes. She named every girl currently enrolled, her age, her background, and her current level of attainment. She presented letters from employers who had taken on girls trained at the school. She presented the original lease, the continuous payment records, the inspection reports from 2 successive borough surveyors who had found the building in educational use and in good repair. She did not raise her voice. She did not use the word injustice, though she thought it several times. She laid the facts in a row and let them make the argument themselves. Lady Cressida's representative argued that the property's highest and best use was commercial, that the surrounding street was developing in a commercial direction, and that the reclassification was a matter of rational civic planning rather than personal interest. He said this with the smooth confidence of someone who had made similar arguments in similar rooms and found them generally effective. The hearing officer asked whether any named supporters wished to address the record. Peregrine was called. He stood, came forward from the gallery, and stood before the hearing officer's table with his hands at his sides and his coat properly buttoned, which was the version of him that society saw. Polished, composed, slightly amused by everything. But when he spoke, the amusement was absent. "I have funded this institution anonymously for 4 years and 7 months, he said. I am willing to state that publicly and on record, with the relevant documentation available for examination. I funded it because it is one of the few institutions in this city that functions precisely as it claims to function. That takes in children who have no other options and gives them the specific skills required to build a life with their own hands. I have reviewed its records. Its enrollment figures are accurate. Its examination results are accurate. Its accounts are in good order." He paused. "I chose anonymity because I believe the school's work was stronger without my name attached to it. I am removing that anonymity now because I believe the hearing record requires the truth, and the truth is that this institution has operated with integrity for 6 years and deserves the legal protection appropriate to that record." He returned to his seat. The hearing officer deferred the reclassification petition indefinitely pending further review. A final property deed transfer still needed to be signed and registered 2 days hence. But the immediate threat was lifted, and Viola gathered her files from the table with hands that were steadier than she had expected them to be, and she did not look at Peregrine in the gallery because she was not certain what her face would do if she did. That night she sat at the school piano until past midnight, playing nothing in particular, fragments of things, the beginnings of pieces she did not finish, the particular kind of playing that is not performance, but thought. At some point she became aware that her chair had acquired something over the back of it. Peregrine's coat, left behind from the hearing, delivered here by someone, Mrs. Partridge probably, with the discretion of someone who understood that its owner had intended it to be left. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned back to the piano and played until the candle burned low, and did not send the coat back. The property deed was signed on a Friday morning and registered by noon. The school was legally secured. Viola stood in the solicitor's office after the final signature and looked at the stamped document for a moment, and felt something shift in her chest that was not triumph exactly. It was quieter than triumph. More like the feeling of setting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long you had forgotten the weight was not simply part of you. 2 days later, the Carrington Winter Ball. It was the largest gathering of the season, and most of the same guests who had been at the Ashford Ball 6 weeks before were present, which Viola knew because she had looked at the invitation list before she accepted. And she had accepted because she was not a woman who avoided rooms. She wore the same deep blue gown. She had considered wearing something different and then decided against it, because the gown had nothing to apologize for, and neither did she. Society watched her arrive the way society watches someone it has been discussing. She could feel it, the particular quality of attention that is not quite staring, the conversations that paused and resumed at a slightly different pitch. Lady Cressida Dunham was at the far end of the room with her circle, and Viola was aware of her the way you are aware of weather, as a fact of the environment that you have accounted for and do not intend to let alter your route. She was speaking with the host's wife about something entirely unrelated to schools or petitions or borough hearings when she became aware that the room's attention had shifted. She turned slightly and saw Peregrine in the doorway. He had paused just inside the entrance, and the pause was deliberate, not theatrical, but the pause of a man who was looking for something specific and intended to find it. The room had arranged itself into a particular silence, the kind that happens when enough people are watching the same thing without quite acknowledging that they are watching. He found her across the full length of the ballroom. He walked the entire length of the room directly to her, not toward the host, not toward anyone else. The full length of the Carrington ballroom, in full view of everyone present, without hurrying and without hesitation. And the stillness he moved through had the quality of something the room had constructed for him without being asked. He stopped before her and took her hand. "I had the figure wrong," he said, quietly. But in the silence the room had arranged, it carried. Not cheaper. I had that entirely backwards. Considerably beyond my reach, it turns out. Viola looked at him. She looked at the room, the watching faces, the paused conversations. Lady Cressida at the far end, with an expression that had gone very still. She looked back at Peregrine, who was watching her with the plain-spoken attention of the man behind the wit, the man who had read financial records in a carriage in the rain, and asked how old the youngest girl was, and funded 4 years of a school he had never visited because he had read 2 column inches in a gazette and recognized something worth sustaining. She executed one perfect curtsy, the same form as the first, the same precision, the same complete composure, carrying now an entirely different weight, in an entirely different direction, chosen freely for entirely different reasons. "Then it is fortunate, my lord," she said, "that I have chosen to lower my price." 2 guests near them began to applaud, and the applause spread outward through the room in a wave that Viola felt in her sternum. At the far end of the ballroom, Lady Cressida Dunham turned and walked toward the door, and the circle around her dissolved in her wake, and the room closed over the space she had occupied as though she had not been there at all. Peregrine did not release her hand. He said nothing further, which was correct, because nothing further was required. The room was still making its decision about what it had witnessed, and Viola could feel the moment settling into the particular shape it would hold in memory. The shape of something public and irreversible, and fully intended by both of the people at its center. Later, when the ball had begun to thin, and the candles had burned lower, and the music had shifted to something slower, they left together, which was also public and irreversible and fully intended. At dawn, in the school's music room, 2 teacups rested on one tray on the small table beside the piano. His coat hung over the back of her chair, not forgotten this time, but placed. The sheet music on the stand was open to the Bach prelude she had been playing the night he had appeared in the doorway, the night she had pressed one note down over his hand and felt the room change around the sound of it. She sat at the piano in the early light, and after a moment he sat beside her on the bench, and she played the first chord of the prelude. She played it again. Then his left hand found the lower notes, and her right hand found the upper ones. and the chord they made together was fuller than either could have made alone. And it rang in the quiet room while the December light came slowly through the window. And the school around them held its 14 girls, its copybooks, its examination records, its deed of legal ownership, and the particular silence of a place that has been fought for and kept.